Good afternoon and welcome to the Scullery Department. This is the third episode in a podcast which is initiated by three former colleagues and still friends: Judith February, based in Cape Town, myself, Ebrahim Fakir, and the person most far away and in another country, Sean Jacobs, based in New York City. We all began working together at the Institute for Democracy in South Africa, IDASA, a long while ago. But many of the conversations that we started then are being carried over now. And we did a lot of work on institution building, on politics, on political party reform, on electoral reform even. And we did work ranging on everything from institution building right through to issues of the budget, land reform, uh, political party finance reform, and a whole range of issues in between. We focused a lot on governance and institution building, and though we had many difficult political conversations, we never let that affect the way in which we worked together and the nature in which we interacted and played together. And so much of the work we did at IDASA was also playtime with a bit of work time. Uh, though many of our conversations began then, we've carried them through now, even though we're based in different cities, pursuing different ideals and different career paths. We still retain an abiding interest in issues of public affairs, on public economy, and on decent politics and a fairer society. And that's what we initiated this podcast for. And so today we want to talk about issues related to some of the things that we did on work back then, but we want to talk about coalitions. But before we get to coalitions, many people wonder why the name Scullery Department. Sean, I'll leave that to you.
Thank you very much, Ibrahim. Before I say that, I just want to remind people this is our third episode, and we've done two others that you can watch on our YouTube channel. So the Scullery Department takes its name from a tune. It was the last tune on the first and only album by the Jazz Pistols, a South African ensemble from the late 50s and early 60s. And one of the band members, Kipi Muketsi, others were like Yuma Sekela and Abdullah Ibrahim, then known as Dollar Brand. Kipi Muketsi, when he was asked about why did you write the song, he said, I was trying to make a song about referring to the Black musicians under apartheid who were good enough to play for white patrons in a restaurant, but were only allowed to sit in the scullery, which is like the back kitchen.
Yeah, and Sean likes to think that he bullied us into this name. Judith persists on ragging him about the fact that he bullied us into the name. But the truth is that we're all, for one reason or another, like the name and went for it, not least because we all like Abdullah Ibrahim, then known as Dollar Brand. But Judith, you had another reason for why you wanted to embrace this name.
Yeah, thanks, Ibrahim, and thanks, Sean. So the Scullery also, I think why I was also kind of happy to be bullied, I would say, is that it does refer to a place where messy work is done in preparation for cooking, and so it's a place where you're creating a mess. And it all reminded me of that popular protest song, my mother was a kitchen girl, my father was a garden boy, that's why I'm a socialist. And so I think that those two, it all actually comes together very nicely, because this is where we're going to have the messy conversations, the ones that are unfinished, and the arguments, the disagreements, and also the agreements. So, I've reconciled myself to the title for the podcast.
Well, given that this is the messy work, or this is where the messy work is being done, as has been customary for previous episodes, we kind of muddle through some of the things which have struck us of late, something you read, something you watched, something you listened to. Typically, it's been something we read, but, Sean, of course, innovatively brought in a film that he spoke about in one episode. But Judith, let me throw to you. Anything you've been looking at that struck you over the past little while?
So thanks, E. I mean, it's not something that I've read, because I'm actually, at the moment I'm trying to finish a novel, so I don't think I'm going to bore people with that. But it's actually an art exhibition that I went to see. I was in London recently, and that sounds terribly pretentious, but it's just I don't mean for it to be. And so I know I can almost see Sean wanting to rag me as I said that. anyway, I went to a very small exhibition of Amy Sherald's work. She is an artist and most famous for her portrayal of Michelle Obama in the Smithsonian, but actually, in a way, she finds that quite unfortunate because she's been doing so much work before then that, people kind of forget about that and they go, oh, the person who painted Michelle Obama. So it's unfortunate. But I thought what was very interesting, it was a very small exhibition as part of London Frieze Week. And, she has these very powerful images of Black people in ordinary situations, so kid on a motorcycle, couple sort of staring out into the distance, kind of the ordinariness of life. And I was then reading up about her, the background to her. Is that a New York City siren I can hear in the background? And I was reading up about the way in which she paints. And I thought it was a very interesting paragraph, and I want to read it above the noise of the siren. That's a New York City siren, yes. Maybe you should mute yourself. And she says when she's painting these pictures of portraits of Black people doing ordinary things, and she uses a grayscale to depict their skin tone. And she says, at first it was a practical choice. But then she says later, I'm not trying to take race out of the work. I was just trying to figure out a way to not to make it the most salient thing about the paintings. My work doesn't commit Black life to grief. There's an assumption of a whole of Black life being inextricably tied to struggle. And I think it becomes all-consuming and really can codify our existence and our whole experience. And she talks about painting Black people in a way to present themselves as they want to be seen, and for the rest of the world to see Black people in that way. And I thought it was fascinating, the use of color, but also, the ordinariness of it. And it kind of reminds me of some of the conversations we have around kind of growing up during apartheid and so on, how people are seen. And that, at the top of this layer of kind of systemic injustice, there are ordinary people trying to live their lives. And so I found that quite interesting and illuminating. So it wasn't something I read, but something I saw. Sean.
Well, I'm going to stick to the sea. So I finally watched this documentary called Influence. It came out in 2020.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, by Diana Neal and Richard Poplack. Quickly, it's about the phenomena of weaponized communication. And it investigates the rise and fall of the world's most notorious public relations and management firm called Bell Pottinger. And as we know, that firm had its comeuppance in South Africa. At the heart of the film is Tim Bell, whose political career started when he brought his skills from advertising to Margaret Thatcher's campaign for Prime Minister in 1979. Now, eventually he makes it to South Africa, first to do the National Party's racist and divisive campaign in 1994, which now I kind of understand, like all those like pamphlets that they were sending in like colored neighborhoods. The ANC's gonna burn down your church, they're gonna take away your religion. You now see where all that stuff came from. And then he worked for the Guptas when they cynically exploited the economics of race in South Africa with their campaign around white monopoly capital. Overall, this film is very compelling. It's worth the watch, and it deserves all the praise that it gets. Now, Judith's like, I was waiting for this to drop. That said, I feel, for me, I just thought it was too big, it was too sweeping. It couldn't decide whether or not it wanted to be a film about Tim Bell or about political influence or manipulation. So what happens is like it just leaves too many loose ends. And just bear with me. It's important, and this is actually a very important story for South Africa. It's important that the story about how Bell got his political start with Margaret Thatcher, and actually he was a true believer in conservatism. A lot of people don't know this, but I think it spends like too much time on that prehistory. He's a genius. When I think it could have spent more time on what happened once he went international. So first, like he sold his skills to General Pinochet, like Thatcher introduced them in Chile. Then he sold it to the Saudis, Assad's in Syria. I mean, you can see where this is going. And that is how it ends up in South Africa, with de Klerk's National Party. So then that makes more sense. We also, by the way, learned that his father had immigrated to South Africa when he was a child and had loved it. So you should make your own conclusion about that part. When I say like it doesn't add up, like the film rushes through the South African story about Bell Pottinger and the Guptas, like he does a good, the directors, they do a good job about the early 90s, as I said, and they're involved in the MP's campaign. And also he does a good job of explaining like the proxy war between the ANC and Inkatha. Now, who are the stars of the shows? And this is part of the problem for me at some level, or the possibility of the film. It's Marianne Tam of the Daily Maverick and the former DA MP Phumzile van Dam. Now, Tam, as you know, she's famous for rummaging in the EFF's garbage in Camps Bay to uncover the party's corruption. Among other things. I mean, she's a really good journalist, but like basically in this film, I think they're just trying to make her off of like, she's interesting, but she's also kind of quirky. Like she still has a tape deck in her car. And then as someone who is very interested in South Africa's, the one part, and I'll end with this, is the part that I've thought, it's the pace is good. And as I said, there's a little unevenness. But the part where I was like, I don't know where this is going, is like, if you're interested in South Africa's political future, and given that we're going to talk about coalitions today, so like, where is our payday going to come from? Where's our politics that's not the politics, the corrupt, kind of self-interest politics of the ANC as it exists now, or the DA with its sort of narrow politics of basically defending, if you want, white, what the kids call white privilege. Where would that come from? So I was particularly interested, how would the film look at the development of political opposition? And the film seems to suggest that our saviors are middle-class movements like Zuma Must Fall and Van Dam. So the ending, at the end of the film, you see the Zuma Must Fall protest, but you don't really get any sense of its race, class, and ideological characteristics. They never explain. They just like shadows moving across the screen, and you're just supposed to think like, that's gonna save us. And also, Phumzile and the DA gets a lot of airtime. There's like so many visual cues to drive this point home. And Marianne Tam actually kind of says something like that. So I thought that took away from me for a bit. I couldn't also understand why Phumzile was the star of the film. He filmed at like DA rallies. They also later filmed her like in the studio where she's being interviewed. She describes herself as a tiger. There's like many like these weird digital close-ups of her, like in cars and marching at rallies. And so you were like, why is she in this film? Like, she obviously did something interesting around this Bell Pottinger case, but I couldn't really figure out what it was. And finally, and this is, I think, probably the part that I really struggle with, the film concedes, Marianne Tam says it, many people say it in the film, that white monopoly capital is a real thing. And the film is upset that the Guptas, the Zumas, the Zuptas, the Bell Pottinger Bots, Andile, Kutama, and Black First, Land First, they exploited this problem in South Africa for selfish needs and to divide South Africa. But here's my problem. The film didn't tell us what we should do about that inequality. So it's kind of like the film's like, white monopoly capitalism gets exploited. But white monopoly capitalism is also a problem. But then the film says like, oh, it's Zuma Must Fall and Phumzile van Dam. I couldn't get my head around that. Yeah.
But I suppose that's not the purpose of the film, to go beyond that and solve the inequality problem. But I mean, I haven't watched it.
Totally, I get what you're saying, and I like the writings of Poplak on the Daily Maverick and so on. And I'm a fan sometimes of the stuff he writes. I will say this though, I was sort of like, I think it's the confusion about what is this film about? Is it about Bell Pottinger, or is it about South Africa? And I think the sort of the what do you call it? Like the promise is like it's gonna help you make sense of what's happening in South Africa. And then when you get the South Africa story, what you get is like a combination, if you want, of muckraking media, and I'm fully behind that one, Zuma Must Fall, and Phumzile van Dam, like that As we know, Phumzile Van Dam doesn't even live in South Africa anymore. I shouldn't speak. I don't live in South Africa either. But it's that thought, just like the kind of the ending didn't add up for me.
Well, I don't know if she...
Watch it. Watch it.
But also, I mean, Sean, just your point about, you're not sure how she fits into the film. I think that's also another malaise of South African public life, is this kind of politician as celebrity, or somebody in public life. And we've talked about this before. So whether it's Phumzile Van Dam because she resigned from the DA in a sort of dramatic way, or, Lindiwe Mazibuko inserting herself into, some of the debates, but always with a kind of, it will be sensationalized, or it will be made as politics as celebrity, or anybody who's done something. We see it with Chidi Madonsela, it's not people in public life who are doing their job in a sort of steady, calm way. We have to make celebrity out of them, and they are the ones who've saved us, right? Or who could save us. And so it's, not perhaps the fault of, maybe in some of these people, but this happens, and it is an irritation of mine, but also I think we do ourselves in, because we constantly trying to do that, and it's distracting, and it often adds no value. So I get the point, but Brian wants to call us to order.
Yeah, I know we got to move on, but like Phumzile.
Yeah, surely this is not a podcast about the film.
No, this is nice that we just kind of like talk. This is also about
we're just shooting the breeze, babe.
Phumzile did go, I think, to the British Parliament. There was like a public hearing about this. No, I'm lying. The Association of Public Relations in Britain, I forgot their full name now. They had like a hearing into Bell Pottinger. That's how kind of they fell apart. He resigned, Tim Bell resigned, the company fell apart and so on. And they got banned. They got sort of banned. There were sanctions against them. So it started with Phumzile Van Dam had written to them to make a complaint. So she was asked to come to Britain to come and make a case. And there's some dramatic, the film suggested there was like a dramatic kind of weird showdown in the hallway between her and one of the representatives of Bell Pottinger. And they gave the evidence. But you're like, it doesn't, this moment that's going to be this payoff didn't come. I think that was sort of my... So I see it's probably, I think it's more like the stuff that was done by the group of journalists. I think it's like Amabungani, the Daily Maverick, who get these access to all the emails. That's in the film, and then they expose it. But yeah, there was just the Phumzile Van Dam, they have this weird camera type of high-tech or digital cameras. That is so ridiculous to watch. And she wears this hat, and yeah, that part I was like, I don't know what's going on here. But in any case, it is a good film.
We need to move on.
I would watch it together, and I'll stop after this.
Interesting thing here is not Phumzile Van Dam, and the interesting thing here is not Phumzile Van Dam, nor the camera angles, nor the shots, nor the visuals of this film. The interesting connection for me is between what
you hate
Judith
media,
was talking about
Ibrahim,
in terms of race and... No, I don't hate media. I love the media. I'm always in it. I'm always in it. But there's a deep connection between the question of race and foregrounding of race, and the connection between race, class, and inequality, and the coalitions which are struck around them. And this film may show, or may not adequately show, in your reading, Sean, that they struck a coalition but foregrounded some particular elements of the coalition to show that they were decisive in it, but actually it was something else. And onto today's topic, the interesting thing for me is that when the parties decide to leave or enter coalitions, they use race as a proxy. So the ANC would try to dislodge the DA in the city of Joburg and elsewhere, funny enough, used race and said it's the black parties who are coming together now. And what struck me was, why didn't the black parties decide to come together at the time? So that's just happening in the city of Joburg. come 2024, people are wondering, is there going to be a coalition of a different kind? Will there be different classes which come together, or is this merely political parties who decide in their leadership that this is what works for us? And that's the big debate now. So I don't think it's far-fetched to think that the conversation we were just having about this film is completely unrelated to coalitions. What it's showing us is that there is a compacting and a coalitioning, if there is such a word, happening amongst elites, but it's not happening on the basis of drawing elements in society to come together to serve a particular public purpose for particular groups or classes in society, right? There's entirely something else happening. And so, I mean, the big issue about coalitions, slightly different from what we've been talking about, is because of the instability which is now being experienced in the city of Johannesburg. It's spread to the Ekurhuleni, and it appears to be something which bedevils all these kind of what I would in effect call minority governments. But we're obviously close to the action, Sean. You're far away, and was wondering what you thought, what you make of this when you're watching it, because you're not directly sort of living under it.
I mean, I think for me it's good to start with like two big points. Maybe that might help the discussion in South Africa. So one is when you were just saying, when we're just kind of moving away from this film, and we should not make this around this film. But so I think there's two ways in which coalition politics is probably going to happen in South Africa. One, there's going to be extra parliamentary coalitions, and the anti-corruption, the sort of the stuff around Bell Pottinger, the so-called RET forces, or the kind of Zuma must fall, Daily Maverick, Phumzile Van Dam coalitions. That's outside of parliament. That assumes that the ANC, in both cases, it assumes that the ANC is the dominating political force and that you are trying to influence that political force. I think you can make the same argument for the early 2000s with the social movements that were emerging in South Africa, particularly, I would say, in Johannesburg and Durban, the anti-privatization forum, the treatment action campaign, and so on. Again, these were extra parliamentary coalitions of a kind that wanted to force change in South Africa, mostly at that point through the courts, or they wanted to see if they could influence the executive. Now, what we're talking about now in South Africa, from where I'm sitting, is there is an understanding that the ANC will either just get about 50% of the vote, or will drop to below 50%. And there's all kinds of opinion polls coming out in South Africa from various organizations, some more reputable, some I've never heard from, but it seems that there is a consensus about this story, about 50 or below. So what that means is we are going to enter an era that is a lot like stuff that we might see in, say, Scandinavia, Germany. We might see in other African countries like Malawi or Kenya, where people are going to start forming coalitions to govern. That's the story of 2024 at a national level. So what you'll have is the classic definition, right, which is that you're going to have a government that is going to be formed jointly by more than one political party, and that's you have that in Britain. That's like normal, like in Britain, where you have, like, say, the Conservatives make a government with the Liberal Democratic Party. We could debate like what happens when the smaller party forms the coalition. Like the Liberal Democrats in that case, it was kind of the dead of their party when they joined that coalition. Or when you have some parties from Northern Ireland form the coalition with the Conservative Party, it was a very fragile one. The one I think that led to Theresa May's government. Subsequently, it's also the government of Boris Johnson who was in that same coalition, etc. So that's that kind of coalition that's it. Now for South Africa, and then I'll stop after this. It's obvious that 2016, when the ANC lost control of think it was something like 3 or 4 metros. They lost control of Tshwane, which is kind of border, the capital city of South Africa, the Joburg Metro, which is Johannesburg, right? And they also lost control of Nelson Mandela Bay, and they'd always not had control of Cape Town. So people were like, hold up, you can actually run these cities through these coalitions. Mm-hmm. The question is, and we could go into that, and I'll stop after this, what are the bases on which these coalitions were formed? Because they seem to shift all the time. People withdraw, people come in. The idea behind the coalition is hopefully you have a better representation of various interests in a society towards like a national program to change the society, to develop it better. That's the idea of coalitions. Also, you bring in smaller constituencies that may not have a say. You bring them into government, and you have some kind of consensus. The downside is it seems from the experience from South Africa, and there's lots of research on this. I should cite her here, Susan Boysen, who's a South African social scientist, has done a lot of writing on coalitions in South Africa, and I think it's proper to just like shout her out. She shows you that like the history of coalition in South Africa is none of what, and I'm not saying it isn't volatile in Britain, or it isn't, I mean, the Kenyan case is often just convenience. So, but what we're seeing in South Africa is just, it's about shifting parties because you're giving me a position. We've also seen signs that people are there's lots of news reports and arrests of people being paid money to vote in a certain way. So yeah, for me, I think watching from the outside, I think that's how I view it.
It's interesting that you sort of distinguish the basis on which these partners come together, so to speak, right? And you're pointing out that some of them, at least elsewhere, were based on a programmatic set of ideas. They may not work, but at least there's some underlying programmatic approach. Kenya, I'm afraid, was slightly different. Kenya, I believe, was much like South Africa, or the experience at local government in South Africa, where it's just about capturing power. Because what happened in Kenya is enemies from one election became co-partners in the next election. And the funny thing is that in Kenya, they kind of announce these things before an election, that they're going into this thing. In South Africa, it's generally done after an election. There's pros and cons, obviously, to both. But Judith, I want to come to you. I mean, you're watching it closer than Sean is, even though you're not having to live under it since you're in Cape Town. Like some of us have to live under this instability that's experienced.
But just before Judith answers,
like continuity.
Cape Town, Town, we've had our fair share of coalition. Cape Town, can you hear me? We've had our fair share of coalition politics. And so I think that's what Sean wanted to say. And I mean, I remember, during our Darcy years, having to follow some of that chaos. In 2006, the DA-led coalition with Helen Zille as mayor. And then, as I recall, and I've got a note here, I mean, it was a mishmash of things, the ID, the ACDP, the UDM, the Freedom Front Plus, all coming together. But Sean, I think your point, and firstly about Susan Boysen's research, I mean, I think, she knows the ANC as well as anyone, and her latest piece, which I think was in The Conversation, I mean, she talks about exactly what you're talking about, this opportunism which comes in. So it's got nothing really to do with trying to make the city work better. I mean, I think today's headline, Ebrahim, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, was about the ANC and the EFF trying to collapse the coalition in Ekurhuleni. And, none of these conversations are really about better governance. And so I think that is, that's obviously unfortunate. And, Sean, to your point about the kind of the Scandinavian models, I mean, it's like, Denmark and so on, getting to Denmark. It just, in South Africa, I think there is, or Germany, for example, I think we lack this sort of political maturity in a sense. I mean, I think in Denmark, they've been doing coalitions for over 100 years. It's a way of living. And Susan in her research talks about, this decline of one party, the one party dominance. And so it's kind of this fragmented chaos takes its place. And so for me, the question is, if this is going to be how we are going to live, and I think that, I don't think even in Cape Town, the Western Cape, I think that the DA are very well aware that, they need to be delivering, seen to be delivering. I don't think it's an accident that we've got a very energetic DA mayor who is spending a lot of his time, not in the leafy suburbs, because I think they understand what the future is, and there's a threat to everyone, for this kind of dominance. You can't rely on it. And so if the question for me is, if this is the future, and Ebrahim, I'm going to come to you because you say that you think it's a lazy analysis. I'm praising you for us to say the coalition is the future, and Sean's just made the case for it from different polls. Without there being elections, and then once we stare it in the face, we must deal with it. But I think for me, the bigger question is how do we get to a point where, if this is a way of living in very important cities like Johannesburg, the economic hub, it's dysfunctional, and how do you rescue it? How do you form a better politics? Which I think is also part of the running theme of our podcast series is, how do we get a better politics? And that to me is the more interesting question than a lot of this just narcissism, opportunism, poor politics, and just snouts in the trough. What's happening in Johannesburg is just, and then the courts get involved. The courts should not be involved in this sort of thing, but it's become the last resort because, that's what we do now. If we can't solve our political problems, we go to the courts. The law is not meant for that. So so to me, it's about, what does that future look like?
Sean?
Oh yeah, I was gonna speak after Ebrahim, but I may as well put it out now. So on Judith's point about, and I'm curious to hear what is it that Ebrahim has a problem with coalitions. So I think in South Africa, nobody thought about coalitions as sort of like, oh, this is the inevitable. I think the understanding was and I think Susan Boysen makes some of this work, where it's like the ANC came to power, it had all this legitimacy. It actually did do a lot of stuff. Like initially, when it had all this legitimacy, it used the state to an extent to change the country. I saw some stats that was quoted in an article in The Economist from last year before the local government election. They mentioned the poor got housing, running water and electricity, the murder rate, the best proxy for violent crime, quoting from them, fell from 93 to 2011. Real income rose for pretty much everyone. But then they say unemployment also now is at a record high. Real incomes have only grown for the richest 5%. Public services are collapsing. So this is not just like, oh, we want coalitions. It's a sign that the project of the ANC didn't pull it off. Now, the problem. One of the problems I have with coalitions is you could win elections with coalitions. Lula just showed that when he beat Bolsonaro, that he could only do it with coalitions with these small right-wing parties. That's how he came to power. So in the legislature, here's where the problem of coalitions come in. If you have a clear agenda, which is let's say the ANC in its first two terms, Mandela and Mbeki, and for all the problems of Mbeki, you're trying to deliver certain things, okay, and you deliver them. The problem is if you still have that agenda, let's hope that the ANC was still, let's say we assume the ANC still had an agenda to transform South Africa, but it doesn't have the numbers inside a legislature to make laws, to change budgets. Do you know what I'm saying? And in the government, it has to govern by coalition. It has to give ministries to the opposition to form a new government. Then there's going to be very little change in South Africa. Now, and my last point on this quickly is, you should notice who also has the most appetite for coalitions. I've seen a lot of articles where Steenhuisen is saying, oh, I don't mind making, I don't want to make a coalition with the EFF, but you know what? I could form a coalition with the ANC. I don't know if you've seen these articles, which is, you have to ask, like, why are certain parties, if it's about ideology, perhaps, why are they so interested in coalitions? Because if you, and I think that's the DA's politics. I mean, this is probably why Musimamani and others have left the DA. The DA doesn't seem really committed to, say, a program to change South Africa. And that's where it's run into trouble. And now it wants to make a coalition in South Africa, I think, to keep stalling, to stall change. And this is just to bring it back to my Brazilian point. Lula is now going to enter government, but weak. He doesn't have, he doesn't need 50% of the vote. So he has to make coalitions with smaller right-wing parties to govern. And if that's going to be the case in South Africa, what we will have is just at a policy level, not much is going to change for regular people. And then, as Judith pointing out, but in the governance side of it, it's going to just be envelopes, positions, money. And so we end up with like the worst of two worlds.
And that's,
Can I just add something very quick?
Right now.
Yeah, can I just add a very small point? Sorry, E, but just I also think the way in which these coalitions play out is quite different at a national level to provincial and then local level. So, and if you think about South African governance, I mean, a lot of the if you look at the metros, I mean, there is a lot going on there in terms of tenders, in terms of getting your hand on the tiller, so to get things done. So it is a very lucrative kind of prospect for many people to want to get involved at that point. And I'm wondering whether, so if you're looking at it from a provincial and local government level, that it's quite a different is the politics, I'm asking the question, slightly more mature if you had, say, the ANC coming in at 47 and, has to form a coalition with a couple of other people, who that will be, we'll talk about later. But might that not be something which looks more mature than what we're seeing at the local government level and at provincial level? I don't know, but I do think it could play itself out slightly differently. But I don't know if I have, that's just my instinct. So I don't know if
I
you
don't
guys
think so. Have you looked? Okay. Have you looked at the majority of Parliament? Have you looked at the majority of Parliament?
Yes. No, I mean, I spend a lot of time following Parliament, and yes, I agree. But, I suppose I'm harking back to the kind of, because if you think about it, and Susan Boyson mentions this in her article, the government of national unity, but then, that didn't end up working so well. But I suppose I'm hankering to that point where we could all be mature and go, okay, but Ebrahim, I mean, we're also immature and intolerant and opportunistic. So
just two quick points from me. Two quick points.
We're not just intolerant and opportunistic. I mean, the government of national unity failed because de Klerk was short-sighted. There was nothing more to it than that. It was just short-sighted. And he stayed on.
Okay, I mean,
he stayed on, that could have worked.
And the ANC had 66% of the vote, so it's not like I think that coalition at that national level, that coalition was more to overcome.
Very different,
to overcome something of we need to stabilize this country, and the ANC could have governed on its own, but it made a coalition because it had the political will. So that's a different kind of coalition. In South Africa, however, there are other kinds of coalitions like KwaZulu-Natal, I think the ANC and the IFP made a coalition because there was an idea that they need to govern in the interest of the province. I mean, when I need to go look back and see if they actually did that, but they claim that that's what the two of them wanted to do together. The other point I just quickly want to make about the problem of coalition in South Africa is your point of, like, let's say the ANC had 47% of the vote, and then it makes these coalitions with other parties. The assumption, then we have to assume that that ANC at the 47% mark has like a clear program to transform South Africa, because I have an interest in that. That's where I'm coming from. They need to transform South Africa, make it less unequal, less racist, integrate it more, create better access to resources. Then it has to form coalitions with other parties that would want that. The problem is, like, that's not what the ANC wants to do now. Like, the ANC that we have, I don't think they're interested in that. The other parties that we have in South Africa, just from their behavior in the metros or at a provincial level, it doesn't look like they're interested in that either. Now, I'm not going to say it's because they're immature or anything. I think that's just a consequence of the kind of, you get what you get. You can't invent politicians. These are the people that we elected. You could argue that this is the other little point I was going to make. There is, and you could better enlighten me about this, the one example where people say, like, the public, is it called the Public Finance Committee of Parliament? Is that the one where there's like Scopa, yeah, where there's this like where everybody is sort of committed to this one ideal of accountability. Now, if that was like an ideological project, let's say in a very sort of technocratic political sense, if the parties was like a Scopa, the parties that govern, then great. But that's not what they are in South Africa. They're not. That's not their reason for being. It seems that the reason for being now is positions. It's the Lil making alliances with the DA in Cape Town, and then it turns out the Lil, who made certain claims about how she's going to govern, just governs like the DA in the interest of landowners and whatever. So it's like that seems to be still the problem in South Africa, is that if other parties emerge there, I keep saying there, for us, then I think it will be, then I would have hope, but not with the way the current setup and the not the goals, like why these people are in politics. I think that's part of the problem.
Well, that's the thing, right? These people are in politics, and they are immature because they are in politics for, quite frankly, private gain. There's nothing more. There's nothing more genuine about the reason they're in politics, and that's fine. But they need to look at what underlines the legitimacy of their exercise of public power once they're in there. And there's very little. I mean, because the rates of participation are declining quite seriously. But don't you guys think? You making a throwaway comment about me saying that it's a little lazy to say that coalitions are the future. And I would insist that actually it is, because assuming that this is the case, an election hasn't happened, the trend might show that that's the case, but let the voters tell you. But interestingly, Judith, you brought up Cape Town, and the first administration in Cape Town, while we were working together at IDASA, was in fact a coalition. The Democratic Alliance was a coming together of the then New National Party, as they called it, and the Democratic Party. And we did a heck of a lot of work then because of that coalition not sustaining itself. They needed all kinds of weird and wonderful things, such as floor crossing, to enable them to unravel this unholy partnership that they had got into. And then we ran into all kinds of problems. So I'm saying, everyone's loving this stuff about coalitions. That's great. If you trace and you are representing particular interests in society in these coalitions, and there they can be far apart if they want. They don't have to be ideologically close, as long as they can sort of agree on a trajectory of interest that they'll want to pursue. Do you think that may ever be possible in a country like South Africa?
Gosh, that's a pregnant silence from me and Sean. So I think that probably says it all. But I don't have much hope for that, certainly in the near future. Again, is what kind of, as Sean says, if there's an alternative that, that there is. But with the current crop of people, and again, Sean, I mean, we talked about this earlier in the podcast about the ideological, what are the ideological reasons here? Well, we don't see it. We don't see the kind of, okay, this is why we're actually, although the ANC will pretend that it is, or the DA will pretend that it is. But as you say, Steenhuisen's saying, oh, well, we could possibly get into a coalition with the ANC. I mean, technically that, shouldn't be even spoken, because they're meant to be so different. So I can't see it being positive in the near future, I'm afraid, not to be so dark, but and not to drive home the point again that what we're seeing is an unedifying spectacle. And I think that it also, the kind of bad actors, so the EFF and that brand of democracy, I think that becomes, it plays itself out in more dangerous ways if in the future, I think, with regard to coalitions. So I'm not optimistic.
So firstly, on the negative answer, it's very obvious, and this goes back to something that Ebrahim said quickly. Maybe he said it at the beginning when we were talking about at the end of our film discussion, when he asked, why didn't the black parties come together? So there's two kinds of things that can happen in South Africa. And this is purely speculation. Well, the one, I think there's more, for the first one, I think there's more evidence. It's very obvious that there is a kind of black conservatism emerging in South Africa tied to race politics, but a kind of right-wing version. So there's different kinds of versions of this, the RET versions, etc. And RET and these people, I think they have some overlapping that they have. So yeah, Action South Africa, they are taking, at this point, it's not huge, but of all the groups that have left the DA, Musi Mamani left, these other sort of technocratic types, Lindiwe Mazibuko left and started like a think tank, I think. The only one who is having success in the political arena, from my perspective, is Action South Africa. They've apparently won, and you can correct me on this, lots of local government councillors. They made some inroads in that. Some of the independents are probably closer to them than I think they are to the ANC or the DA. So if there's going to be some kind of black coalition politics, it could be of that sort of black conservatism, and people will enter it at like various xenophobia, God, anti-corruption, and then you find like some kind of weird common ground, bootstraps capitalism, and they all are just sort of like going to band together. So I can see that as one thing. The other is something where one of the existing parties rebrands themselves as a party of these kind of new currents, the professionals, the Zuma Must Falls, the kind of independent, sort of mostly liberal South African media, like find a voice in that party. So, and I think the best example of this is and I'm going to use an example from the US. If you look at I'm thinking of like taking state power, taking councils, taking city councils, not like electing one councillor. Until the mid-1960s, the Democratic Party in the US was considered like the party of white interests. The Republican Party was the party that freed slaves. The Democratic Party in the South was quite racist, but somehow the Democratic Party, I think it's the '68 Congress in Chicago where Fannie Lou Hamer stood up. And this is a little too much American history, but that's the one that changed the Democratic Party into becoming then the party of women, gay people, black people, poor, marginalized, poor people, poor black and white people, trade unions. So a party that wasn't historically a party, if you want, of the center left in America, became the party of the center left. You see this kind of stuff on Facebook where people are praising the mayor of Cape Town now for stuff that he's doing. I'm not convinced. PR is PR. But there's lots of people who are like, oh, I love what the mayor of Cape Town is doing. And these are sort of people that you historically thought of as progressives. So there was a possibility for the DA to let's say the DA could have done that. But the problem with the DA is the modern DA as we know it, it's not like, say, it's not Helen Suzman. It's Fight Back. It's Helen Zille. So it could have been that in South Africa. I don't think it can be. They're stuck at like that 25%. they don't want to form coalitions with the third largest party, which has the other 10. So they could be 35 plus like ACDP, blah, 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 blah. But they cannot do it because the EFF, their vision for South Africa is, I think, closer to the ANC, even though it sounds crazy now, but I think it's closer to electorally to the ANC. My sense is like, it's going to be neither of those, but there's going to be something else that's going to emerge. I have more interest in ideologically what the student movements presented in South Africa between 2015 and 2017, like connecting patriarchy, privatization, and racism in South Africa, but not figuring out how to make that like a broader thing in South Africa. That for me was their little problem. They sort of like, they made the ANC patriarchy, they made the reproduction of, if you want, like apartheid through the new constitutional order of '94. And of course, some of them were crude, some of them were more sophisticated about it. And they talked about that if in effect, South Africa was now a neoliberal economy. They did a really good job at the university of doing that. They didn't make it more widely available in the society. So that's where I think there's going to be interesting politics in South Africa if we're thinking about coalitions to transform the country.
That's very interesting, Sean. I mean, that's the extra parliamentary stuff. But sorry, E, yeah.
But it's still fundamentally based on race, and it appears as if inescapably no one wants to get away from trying to understand.
It can't be not race in South Africa. It's going to be race in South Africa.
And yet, in every public opinion survey, the problem of race ranks at 6 or 7.
Yeah, I would. Are you mentioning the IRR surveys? Because I'm not going to take my.
No, it's not the IRR. There's much more reliable surveys other than the IRR, like the Afrobarometer, like the stuff.
Ebrahim, if I tell you, I don't. My top priority is the fact that I don't have a job, or my top priority is housing. That's inextricably linked to my mostly racial position in South Africa. Whether or not it's still apartheid that is primarily responsible for how I live, or whether it's the policies of the new government, I'm still experiencing that stuff as racial. Maybe not you, me, and Judith, but that's like the majority of the people in South Africa. They're not going to call it race anymore. They're going to say jobs. It's the jobs. It's housing. It's healthcare. That's not the position of like a white South African. Their unemployment is less than between 1% and 5%. So I think race it's taken new forms, but
no, that's not the issue.
E, go ahead.
Oh, but the issue here is that you're assuming that race is not salient. No one's arguing that race is not salient. The question here is whether race is used distribution. If race is the question for redistribution and development, that you're talking about an entirely different equation. But that's not the manner in which politicians are using the question of race. Funny enough, incidentally, John Steenhuisen's not the only one who argued for an ANC-DA coalition. I did too, for particular reasons. And those reasons are very simply, given the empirical reality of where things are right now, there's no other party that can give you the kind of institutional stability you require for decent and stable government, at least in the short term. Nor do you have anyone who represents two large bodies of interests in society. Yep, the ANC and the DA are the only two parties. If you look at local government, even nationally, they're the only parties which largely win wards. All other parties are aggregated interests across a proportional representation system. So if you want social solidarity, if you want some kind of institutional stability for government to flourish, and you want some kind of institutional integrity, this is probably the only coalition which makes sense in the short term. Simply because what you have in any alternative is institutional ambiguity and politicized uncertainty. And it's in the space of politicized uncertainty where the question of race is foregrounded, not for redistributive purposes, but for political capital purposes.
We were here for one more hour, which we're not going to be. I can break down for you why the ANC is not good on their record on stability.
Yes, no, because
their record on stability. He says on stability. And what was your second criteria? You had another second criteria
institutional integrity.
Institutional integrity. You want to talk about both the ANC and the Democratic Alliance on institutional integrity, or just in terms of governance. If you live in the Western Cape, this whole sort of, the Western Cape is well governed. You try living in Elsie's River or living in, I don't know, Guguletu or something like that, or Manenberg.
Sure. Can I just say on that? Yeah. I think it's because the rest of the country is in such dysfunction that the DA government looks better from wherever it is.
Wherever you are sitting. Where does the DA government, if I'm sitting in a backyard
I agree. No, I'm just saying, I mean, this is going to sound a terrible thing to say, but to the literally thousands of kids who come here every year because they perceive that they might get something better, a better school than in the Eastern Cape. I mean, it's a terrible example to use, but I'm afraid that is the reality. I think the reality is, that is our reality. If you're looking at, and if you're middle class, it certainly is. I mean, Ebrahim and I live in these cities. We know what it is. So, and that's not, so it's not a defense of, but I think because the ANC is
I'm not
so
defending
corrupt,
you. I'm not
so
defending
venal,
the ANC.
and so poor. No,
ANC.
I know you're not. I know you're not, and I'm not
ANC
defending the. No, I know you're not, and I'm not defending the DA because I mean, I've got a litany of issues there. But my point is just, I think it's because the ANC has fallen apart and so low that actually we work from that low base. And that, anything else, which is why people are welcoming Gayton McKenzie and wherever he is, the mayor or whatever, because it's like,
what does that tell you then? Gayton McKenzie is
that's a right-wing madness.
But where is he governing? The DA used to, that was the ANC or the DA who used to govern there? Was it Prince?
It's I mean, Ebrahim, help me out. What is somewhere in the Karoo? Yeah, Truman Prince.
No,
in the Karoo.
They do they are governing in the Northern Cape.
Northern Cape, yeah. So,
but it's also true that what I'm trying to say to you is like the reason we have a Gatfol and a Gayton and Herman Mashaba, that's not to do with the ANC. I think that's often people who used to vote for the DA.
I'm not sure about that. I mean, Ebrahim, you might have your fingers on the pulse on that. I think it's got.
I'm saying both the ANC. What I'm saying is like both the ANC and the DA are problematic. They are not. I understand Ebrahim's. I know where Ebrahim's coming from.
Yes, sure.
Missing that, but I get that.
They certainly are. You're right. They are.
I think neither of those two.
But your alternative about coalitions in society, that's well and good. But very few of those are actually in power. And of those who contest elections, these are the two largest blocks of constituencies in societies which are represented by these parties. So in that sense, in the short term, to me, that's the only one which makes sense. Every other thing is going to kind of pull things apart at their seams in a way which is going to lead to a greater amount of instability rather than kind of some settlement in the short term.
Okay, this is my last point.
I mean, where should you see?
This is my last point because I know
where would you see?
Yeah, I don't have the answer, and I'm also talking here about different conditions in South Africa. The assumption here that we're making is, as Ebrahim is sort of saying, he's not sure whether that's even the case, that the ANC is 50 or below. Now, extra-parliamentary opposition in South Africa post-apartheid worked really well when the ANC was dominant. When the Treatment Action Campaign was at its strongest was when the ANC was the most dominant party in South Africa. Therefore, it could make the ANC make those changes around antiretroviral drugs. Because that's the truth about South Africa. The most successful post-apartheid national movement that actually affected some kind of change and had an effect on the internal politics of the ANC or of a political party in South Africa was the Treatment Action Campaign. But that was because the ANC was a dominant political party. That's the key. That's not the case anymore. So in a way, that does undermine my argument about these social movements and their maneuvering and how they should, if they figure something out, right? And this is the key point that Ebrahim, I think, is getting at, which is that they will only have an effect if they run electoral politics. And if they manage to convince their followers who support them, like Social Justice Coalition or whoever, that when it comes to election, you must also vote for me. You can't vote, you can't take all the services that I provide to you in between elections, but when it comes to elections, you vote for the ANC or you vote for the DA. So that's the key that these movements have to do, is to convince regular South Africans that when it comes to elections, you also need to give me your vote. Right now, Ebrahim's corrected that, I get you on that, Ebrahim, that's not, that the social movements haven't figured out that part. And we have a history of that. SECC, etc., when they try to run in local government elections in Durban, you remember the Poors of Chatsworth and all that? They didn't even get a seat. Trevor Ngwani, he got elected only on an ANC ticket, then he got expelled by the ANC, but as an independent, he never got elected. So it is true that that's the challenge for the independents, or whatever you want to call them in South Africa. And hopefully if they figure that out, then maybe the scenario that I'm hoping for will get that scenario. But I'm
we're all
not
hoping for an alternative politics. But that's so the conversation's kind of segued into that and that perennial question that we have. And I don't think we answer it in a single podcast. But yeah. I mean, it's a useful. I mean, that's a useful analogy, Sean. That treatment action campaign. But we do need, because
well, I would say treatment action campaign,
social movements. In a sense, social movements. A lot of them have become as fragmented in a sense as some of the political parties. So there's that internal politics that also goes on there, which is sometimes a little bit depressing. So
I don't want to say what political party we need.
Sorry?
I don't want to say what politics we need.
Yes, no, that's fine.
Well, we do know, and perhaps in a future podcast we can embrace the question of what kind of alternative politics we need. But I think
I want to discuss the Springboks.
Oh, happy to.
Well, you're on your own on that.
Happy to. I think we should discuss the Springboks. By the way, just on that, so Jason Jenkins, son of all of our former colleague at IDASA, Ivor Jenkins, his son has made the Springbok squad. So maybe he will be starting in Marseille.
So has
on
Ronnie
Saturday.
Caswell's godson.
Oh, Sasha Ngomazulu.
Yeah. So this is
Nick Feinberg's son.
Talk about what other South Africas are available. Yeah. Sometimes you need to look at rugby teams and football teams.
Completely. Yeah, at cricket teams.
Are we out of the ICC, out of the 2020?
Yep.
We are. We crashed out because we lost to the Netherlands, and this is a very, very sore point for me. So
are people blaming affirmative action already?
Sorry?
Are people blaming affirmative action already?
No, I just think everybody played badly. And how can we not?
We've moved on.
How can we lose to the Netherlands? I mean,
Ebrahim's like, I've moved on. I'm done. Ebrahim's like, they didn't.
No, we're done. They all played badly. It's sorry.
I gotta go, people.
Okay. It's a second colonization.
Guys, we've got to
cheers,
wrap
guys.
this up.
Cheers. This was great. This was great. Excellent.
Well, we have wrapped it up.
Bye.
I think it's